For 4 years, Orville's son believed his father had simply abandoned his family, a painful story whispered in their small Arkansas town. The official police theory was a runaway case, a man tired of his life who just drove off into the sunset. But when a record-breaking drought in 2002 peels back the water of the Arkansas River, a lone fisherman discovers a rusted blue truck door half buried in the cracked mud, a single perfect bullet hole blasted through its center. What you're about to hear is a story of how one clue, hidden for years beneath the water, can change everything. Stick with us as we piece together a puzzle that a son had to solve to reclaim his father's name. The hum of the deep freezer was the only sound in the garage as Emmett wrestled with the worn-out tire of his pickup. At 20 years old, his life felt as stuck as the rusted lug nuts he was fighting. It was a sweltering August afternoon in 2002, and the air in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, was thick enough to drink. Every day was the same. Wake up, go to his dead-end job at the auto parts store, come home, and try to ignore the ghost that lived in his mother's sad eyes. That ghost was his father, Orville. 4 years ago, Orville had climbed into his big blue semi-truck for a cross-country haul and had never come back. The official story, the one the town settled on, was that he'd run off. Found a new life, a new woman, anything but the one he had. It was a simpler explanation than foul play, and it was the one that had slowly poisoned Emmett's memories of his dad. He finally broke the last lug nut free and pulled the heavy tire off, his knuckles scraped and greasy. That's when he saw the county sheriff's car pull into the driveway, dust kicking up behind it. A young deputy, someone Emmett vaguely recognized from high school, got out of the car, adjusting his belt. "Emmett Holt?" he asked, though he clearly knew who he was. Everyone knew. "Yeah, that's me." "Your mom home?" the deputy asked, peering toward the house. "She's at work." "What's this about?" Emmett asked, his tone already defensive. Cops only ever came by in the beginning. Now, it was just a cruel reminder. The deputy shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Look, something's come up. An old fisherman down by the river found something. Sheriff wants you to come take a look. Said you'd be the one to know for sure." Emmett wiped his hands on an old rag, a knot tightening in his stomach. "Know what for sure?" "It's better if you just see for yourself," the deputy said, his voice softening with pity. It was the same look Emmett had been getting for 4 years. The drive out to the river was quiet. The drought had been brutal that summer, leaving the mighty Arkansas River looking tired and shrunken. Its banks, usually deep underwater, were now wide plains of cracked, dry earth. They pulled up near a cluster of official vehicles. Yellow tape cordoned off a section of the muddy riverbed. As Emmett got out of the car, the humid air felt heavy and charged with a strange energy. The sheriff, a man named Davies, who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the county on his shoulders for decades, walked over to meet him. "Emmett, thanks for coming," he said, his eyes avoiding direct contact. He gestured toward the tape. "A fellow was out here this morning, casting a line. Saw this sticking out of the mud." Emmett followed his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. There, caked in dried mud and rust, was a deep blue truck door. It was half submerged, tilted at an angle like a strange, broken tombstone. Even with the rust and the years of wear, the color was unmistakable. It was the exact shade of blue from his father's Peterbilt, a color Orville had been so proud of he'd mixed it himself. But it was the detail in the center of the door that made the world go silent. A small, perfectly round hole, the edges of the metal peeled back like a grim flower. "Is that—" Emmett's voice was a hoarse whisper. "We think so," Sheriff Davies said gently. "Your father's rig was a custom job, wasn't it? We never had the VIN on file for the individual parts." Emmett stepped under the tape, his boots sinking into the soft mud as he approached the door. He didn't need a vehicle identification number. He knelt down and ran his fingers over a deep scratch near the bottom corner. He'd made that scratch himself when he was 14, carelessly leaning his bike against the truck. His father had been furious, but then he just sighed, ruffled Emmett's hair, and said, "Well, I guess that's your mark on it now. Part of our story." It was his father's truck door, and his father hadn't just driven off. The runaway story, the narrative of a man who abandoned his family, was a lie. That hole in the door was proof. He hadn't left them. Someone had taken him. The bitterness Emmett had carried for 4 years curdled into a hot, blinding rage, followed by a wave of guilt so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had spent years being angry at a man who may have spent his last moments fighting for his life. "We're reopening the case, son," the sheriff said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This changes things. This is a homicide investigation now." Emmett looked up from the door, his eyes locking with the sheriff's. For the first time, he saw not a cop giving bad news, but a man who looked just as lost as he felt. The local department was small, underfunded, and this case was already 4 years cold. He knew right then that if he wanted real answers, he couldn't just wait for the official investigation to crawl along. He had to find them himself. The next few days were a blur of activity that felt both urgent and agonizingly slow. The police pulled the door from the mud and sent it to a state lab for forensic analysis. Emmett's mother, Helen, took the news with a strange mix of devastation and relief. The hope she had secretly clung to was gone, but so was the shame of being the abandoned wife. Their shared grief, which had been a wall between them, began to feel more like a bridge. But Emmett couldn't sit still. The image of that bullet hole was burned into his mind. He spent hours in the garage, sorting through old boxes of his father's things, looking for anything that might be a clue. All he found were old logbooks, receipts for diesel, and photos of a smiling man who now felt like a stranger. He knew he was in over his head. He needed help from someone who knew how these things worked, someone who wasn't bound by the slow-moving gears of official procedure. There was only one person he could think of: Detective Frank Harding. He was the original investigator on his father's case, a sharp, no-nonsense cop who had retired a year after the trail went cold. Emmett had heard Harding had taken the case personally and was frustrated by the lack of leads. He found his address in the phone book and drove to his small house on the edge of town. Harding answered the door looking older and more tired than Emmett remembered. He was holding a half-finished mug of coffee, and his expression soured when he saw Emmett on his porch. "Emmett Holt," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard they found the door. I was sorry to hear it." "I need your help, Detective," Emmett said, getting straight to the point. "The sheriff's office is doing what they can, but this case is ancient to them. You were there from the start. You knew my dad." Harding took a long sip of his coffee, studying Emmett over the rim of the mug. "I'm retired, kid. I don't chase ghosts anymore." "He wasn't a ghost," Emmett insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "He was my father, and for 4 years I let myself believe he just left us. I can't live with that. I have to know what happened. You're the only one who might have seen something back then. Something that didn't make sense." The old detective was silent for a long moment. He looked past Emmett, toward the street, his eyes distant. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "He talked about you all the time. The way the case was handled, it never sat right with me. The runaway theory was too easy. Too clean." He sighed, a sound of deep resignation. "All right. Come on in. But this is unofficial. You understand? I'm just an old man giving a kid some advice." Inside, Harding's living room was a museum of a long career: framed certificates, a shadow box with his old badge, and stacks of books on criminal justice. He pulled out a dusty cardboard box from a closet. "My old notes," he explained, dropping it on the coffee table. "I kept copies of everything. Let's start from the beginning." For hours, they pored over the 4-year-old files. They reviewed the timeline of Orville's last known movements: a fuel stop in Little Rock, a call to his dispatcher, and then nothing. The truck's GPS had stopped pinging somewhere along I-40 heading west. The key figure in the original report was Orville's business partner, Walt Gibbons. They owned the truck together, and Walt was the one who had officially reported him missing 2 days after he'd lost contact. "Let's go see Walt," Harding said, closing a file. "People's stories change over time. Let's see how well his is held up." Walt Gibbons lived in a nicer part of town now. The small trucking company he and Orville had started had clearly done well for him. A brand new pickup truck sat in the driveway of his large brick house. When he answered the door, his face was a mask of practiced sympathy. "Emmett! Frank! My goodness, come in," he said, ushering them inside. "I heard the terrible news about the door. Just awful. I always told the police Orville wouldn't just run off." "That's not what I remember, Walt," Harding said, his voice flat. "My notes say you were the one who suggested he was having troubles at home, that maybe he just needed to get away." Walt's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, you know how things are. A man's under pressure. You think all sorts of things. But I never truly believed it. Orville was a stand-up guy." Emmett watched Walt closely. The man was laying the sympathy on thick, but his eyes were shifty, constantly darting between him and Harding. "What was my dad hauling on that last trip, Walt?" Emmett asked. "Machine parts," Walt answered immediately. "A big order for a firm out in California. Standard stuff." Harding scribbled a note on his pad. "We'll need to see the manifest for that shipment, and the company records, just to be thorough." Of course. Anything to help," Walt said, already walking them toward the door. "You just let me know what you need. This has just been a tragedy for all of us." As they drove away, Emmett felt a gnawing sense of unease. "He was lying," he said. "I know," Harding replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "The question is, what is he lying about?" That night, Harding called Emmett. His voice was low and urgent. "I was going through my old notes again. There's something I overlooked back then, a scribble in the margin about a call I got from a warehouse manager at the port. He was complaining about a last-minute cargo swap on Orville's truck. Said it wasn't protocol." "A cargo swap?" Emmett asked. Walt said it was machine parts. "Exactly," Harding said. "The manager's name was Peterson. According to this, he retired and moved down to Florida a couple of years ago. I think we need to find Mr. Peterson." The next morning, Harding found a phone number. Emmett sat next to him, listening on speaker as the old detective worked his magic. Peterson was wary at first, but Harding's calm authority eventually got him talking. "Yeah, I remember that," Peterson's voice crackled over the line. "That fella, Orville. Seemed like a decent guy. His partner, Walt, called me that night. Told me to take the machine parts off and load up some pallets of electronics instead. High-end stereos, computers. Said the client was paying a big bonus for a rush shipment. All cash. No paperwork. It smelled bad from the start, but Walt was the boss." Emmett and Harding looked at each other. This was it. The clean, simple story was falling apart. His father wasn't hauling machine parts. He was driving a truck full of untraceable, high-value electronics. It wasn't a random runaway. It wasn't a simple robbery. It was a setup. And Walt Gibbons was right in the middle of it. After the call with Peterson, the path forward became terrifyingly clear. Orville hadn't been on a routine haul. He'd been driving a treasure chest on wheels, and almost no one officially knew it. Harding, using some of his old contacts, started digging into Walt Gibbons' finances from around the time Orville disappeared. It took a few days of calling in favors, but what he found was the final nail in the coffin of Walt's story. A week after Orville's truck vanished, Walt Gibbons had deposited $20,000 in cash into his personal bank account. At the time, he told the bank it was from a lucky weekend at the horse races. "No way a man gets that lucky right after his partner disappears," Harding said, showing Emmett the bank statement he'd gotten from a source. He was paid off. This was his cut. Emmett stared at the paper, the numbers blurring through a film of rage. Walt hadn't just lied. He had profited from his father's disappearance. He had been living a comfortable life on blood money while Emmett and his mother struggled with debt and grief. "We're going to see him," Emmett said, his voice low and hard. "Right now." "Hold on, kid," Harding warned. "This is dangerous territory. Walt's not just a liar. He's connected to people who commit murder for a living. We need to be smart about this." "I don't care about being smart," Emmett shot back. "I want to look him in the eye when his world comes crashing down." They drove to Walt's house in Harding's old sedan, the silence thick with tension. This time there would be no polite questions, no gentle prodding. When Walt opened the door, the friendly mask was gone. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He had clearly been expecting them. "You shouldn't have kept digging," Walt said, his voice barely a whisper. "We know about the electronics, Walt," Harding said, stepping inside without an invitation. Emmett followed close behind, his fists clenched. "We know about the $20,000. Walt stumbled backward into his pristine living room, sinking into an expensive leather armchair. The facade of the successful businessman crumbled, revealing a weak, terrified man underneath. He put his head in his hands. "I didn't want him to get hurt," he sobbed. "You have to believe me. I never thought they would kill him." "Who? Walt?" Emmett demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Who killed my father?" Walt looked up, his eyes bloodshot and full of tears. "Some guys I owed money to. I had gambling debts, bad ones. They knew I was in the trucking business. They heard about a big, off-the-books shipment of electronics coming through. They told me if I gave them the route and the schedule for the truck, they'd wipe my debt clean. I was supposed to get Orville to take a different route, one that was more isolated. It was just supposed to be a simple hijacking. They were going to take the cargo and leave him tied up on the side of the road." He took a shaky breath, the confession tumbling out of him now. "But Orville? He wouldn't just give up the truck. He was too stubborn, too proud. He fought back. One of the guys panicked. He shot him." Emmett felt the floor drop out from under him. He had spent years imagining his father driving away, and now he was forced to picture him fighting for his life on a lonely stretch of highway. "Where is he, Walt?" Harding asked, his voice cold as steel. "Where did they put my dad?" Walt's body shook with sobs. "They told me they had to get rid of the whole rig, sink it somewhere no one would ever find it. There's an old limestone quarry about 30 miles north of here. It's been flooded for decades. They drove the truck in there, with him inside." The confession hung in the air, heavy and sickening. Walt had traded his partner's life to save his own skin. Harding pulled out his phone and quietly called the sheriff, relaying the address of the quarry and Walt's confession. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. As the police took a compliant, broken Walt into custody, Emmett walked out of the house and stood in the driveway, gasping for the humid evening air. He finally had the truth, but it was uglier than anything he could have imagined. The next day, the quarry became the center of a massive police operation. A dive team was brought in, and news crews set up on the perimeter. Emmett and his mother stood on the edge of the police line, watching as the divers disappeared into the murky green water. For hours, there was nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, a giant crane, brought in by the state police, began pulling something from the depths. First came a mess of tangled metal, and then, breaking the surface like a monster from a forgotten age, was the front end of a semi-truck. The blue paint was mostly gone, replaced by a thick coat of slime and rust, but there was no mistaking the shape of the cab. They hoisted it onto a flatbed truck, water pouring from its broken windows. It was a mangled wreck, but it was his father's truck. Later that evening, the coroner confirmed they had found Orville's remains inside. Walt's confession had led them straight to him. The two hijackers, identified by Walt, were arrested in a pre-dawn raid the following morning. One of them still had the gun that had been used. The case, cold for 4 years, was solved in less than a week. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in town changed from gossip to condolences. The story of Orville's murder and Emmett's role in uncovering it spread quickly. People who had once looked at him with pity now looked at him with a quiet respect. The weight of shame he had carried for so long was finally lifted. He and his mother planned a proper funeral. It was a small service attended by family and a few of Orville's old trucker friends. They buried him in the local cemetery under a tall oak tree with a headstone that finally told the truth. Orville Holt, a devoted father and a good man, at rest at last. After the funeral, Emmett stood by the grave long after everyone else had left. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, aching sadness, but also a sense of peace. He had done right by his father. He had taken back his name and his story. Looking at the fresh earth, he finally felt like he could start living his own life. Not as the abandoned son, but as the son who brought his father home. Walt Gibbons didn't pull the trigger, but his betrayal led directly to Orville's death. Does a man in his position, acting out of fear and debt, deserve any measure of forgiveness? Or is his sin just as great as the murders he enabled? We appreciate you listening to the end. Every story has layers, and your perspective in the comments helps us all see them more clearly. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community of truth seekers.